Now that we did learn about one of the most important Next.js features, the file-based routing, it is time to practice what we learned. It is time to apply what we learned in theory to a small demo project. And therefore now it's project time. We're going to apply what we learned. Now in this course section here, we are going to build this little events app where we can browse a list of events, where we can then select a single event, and where we can also filter for events. And we're going to build that with Next.js, of course, and with what we learned thus far. Therefore, in detail, we are going to create this complete project from the ground up together, step by step, so that we really get that practical experience with Next.js. We are going to add both static and dynamic routes to this project because we will need both. And we are also going to add regular React components, so non-page components to this project. Something we haven't done thus far. We didn't add normal components in the last course section. Now we are going to do that, and we are going to connect everything. And therefore, of course, the primary purpose of this project is to practice what we learned, but you will also learn a couple of new things. For example, where to store regular React components. And hence, I definitely recommend that you follow along and go through that project together with me. Of course, if you're feeling super fancy, also definitely pause from time to time and try out the next steps on your own. But with that, let's dive right in and let's create and plan our project. So let's get started with that project. And for this, again, attached you find a starting project, which I did create through the command line as shown in the first course section. But again, it's a slightly cleaned up starting project, which simply ensures that we all start with the same foundation, with exactly the same starting point. So download that attached project snapshot and then open up the terminal, navigate into this project folder. You are already navigated there if you use the built-in terminal in Visual Studio Code. And then run npm install to install all those third-party packages which we need, like Next.js, for example. And with that, we're ready to go. But before we write any code, let's plan our project and let's plan which pages we need, for example. Now, this project will only have 4 routes. But with those 4 routes, we are going to practice all the things we learned in the last course section. We will need a starting page, of course. So for our domain /nothing, I want to reach the starting page, and on that starting page, a list of featured events should be shown. Keep in mind that we are building an application where we show events, where users can browse events, and where they potentially in the future might also be able to book events. That's not the focus of this first demo though. But therefore, of course, we want to show a list of events which users can take a closer look at. And therefore, we want to present such events on the starting page. And in the data which we'll use, we'll basically set a flag determining whether an event is featured or not. And if it's featured, it should show up on that starting page. But therefore, we'll also add a /events route. So our domain /events, which should load a different page, a page with all events. So here we then list all the events we currently offer in our application. Now, of course, users hopefully then also click on some event to get more details about that event and to potentially sign up for it and book it. And therefore, we will also add an events detail page for /events/ and then some dynamic ID. So that will not be hard-coded. Instead, that ID should be dynamic so that we can load the same page, the same detail page for different events and show data about that selected event. And last but not least, I also want to add a feature where users can filter events by year and month, so that I can not just see all events or just the featured events, but that I can also search for all the events that take place in May 2021, let's say. And therefore we'll add another route, another page with such a dynamic slug segment, which will load the filtered events page, where we then show all the events matching our filter here. And we're going to build all these things together in that project. But as I mentioned, of course, also feel free to not jump into the next video immediately, where we will get started with all of that together, but instead try setting up those pages, those routes on your own, even if you don't add all the other logic yet, but try creating those route files on your own and add some dummy data, some dummy output to those page components. And then once you did that, move on to the next lecture where we will build this together. So let's now implement those pages, those routes together. And for this, of course, we go to this pages folder, and in there we can add a new file. A new file for our root page, for our home page, so to say, the Index.js file. This will then hold the component that should be loaded if we visit localhost, or whatever our domain is, /nothing. And therefore in here I'll add the homepage function, so a functional component which I simply name homepage. And of course we also want to export this as a default. We need to do that for Next.js to find that component. And then in there we return the JSX code that belongs to this component. And for the moment I'll just return a div here with a h1 tag where I say the homepage. But in this course section, unlike in the last course section, we are also going to add more output and more logic to our application. So we'll not stick to such dummy output. But for the moment we will, and we will continue adding the other routes. Now we also need a route for all events, and then for that slug, so for consuming all dynamic segments, and for a single dynamic segment for a single event. Hence, we can add an events.js file for our events page, which lists all events, or alternatively, instead of adding that file, we add an events folder in the pages folder, and in that folder, we then add an index.js file. And that's the exact equivalent to adding an events.js file. And I will go for this approach also because we'll need that folder later to set up nested routes for a single event, for example. Because keep in mind that for a single event, for that event detail page, I want to have /events/some dynamic segment. So for that nested route, like for all nested routes, we will need this subfolder, this events subfolder. Otherwise, we won't be able to set up such a route. Hence, we'll need that events folder anyways, and therefore we can already create it for the all events page as well. So in there, we add another functional component, and I'll name it all events page. Of course, those names are up to you though. You can name your page components however you want, but I'll go with this name and then return another div here where I say all events. Again, that's just some dummy content. We'll replace that with actual output and some logic later. Now, two more routes, two more pages to go, and the first one will be the page for a single event. So when we selected an event for displaying all the detail information for this event. Now we want to select that event dynamically by ID, and therefore the page should have a dynamic segment in its URL, so in its path. And you learned how that works. We set up a file with square brackets in the file name, and then between the square brackets, any identifier of our choice. for example, ID, or simply event ID, whatever you want. And I'll go for event ID written like this within capital I, so that I can then later extract that actual event ID from the router, from the query property as you learned it, by that key, so by using that key. And hence in this square bracket event ID file, we add the event detail page. And we of course also export that page, the event detail page. And then here for the moment, I'll also just return a div where I send, say, event detail. Now the last page, the last route I want to add therefore is this slug route. So which consumes all segments, even if that would be multiple segments after, in this case, events, because I'll create it in the events subfolder. And for this, the syntax also is to use square brackets. But then we also add 3 dots like the spread operator in JavaScript or the rest parameters syntax from JavaScript, and then any identifier of our choice, for example, slug. But again, that's just something you will see quite a lot, slug, but you can of course use any identifier you want. Now you might think that this maybe clashes with the event ID, but as long as we enter more than one dynamic parameter after /events, it won't. And that's exactly how we're going to use that. If we just have /events /something, so just one segment after /events, then the slug will not kick in. Instead, this event ID route will then handle such a request or such a URL in the end, as you will see throughout this section. So therefore here in this slug file, I'll name this filtered events page, because here I want to show a list of filtered events, and then we can export this here as well. And of course in the component also return some dummy content here, filtered events like this. And I did spend a lot of time explaining this, but these are of course some key features of Next.js, so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding them. Now with all of that, we can start the development server with npm run dev, and this will now start it up, and we can now open the browser and visit localhost 3000, and we see the home page. Now if we visit localhost 3000/events, we see the all events page. If I enter /events/ let's say E1 as a dummy event ID, I see the event detail page. And if we try out this slug concept and we try to filter for events that take place in 2021 and then May by adding the segments /2021/05 after events, I see the filtered events page. Of course, it will be our job throughout this section to make sure that on that filtered events page, we then extract the actual segment values from the URL and then find appropriate events. But that's exactly part of what we build throughout this section. And therefore with that, we now got the basic setup we need. Now we can gradually start filling that with life. Now to fill that all with some life, we need some data. We need some dummy events. Now later in this course, we will learn how we can fetch data from a database or from the file system, but we haven't learned about this yet, and therefore for the moment, we'll just use a dummy JavaScript array as a data source, but again, that will of course change throughout the course. Nonetheless, for the moment, attached you find a dummy-data.js file attached to this lecture, and you can download this file and add it to your root project folder. So here I added dummy-data.js to my project next to the package.json file, and this is a file with an array of dummy data which I prepared for you, and with some functions that allow us to query that data. And I'll dive into those functions once we start using them. Now, in that dummy data.js file, this dummy data, which is set up there, also uses some images. It also needs some images to be part of the project to then later correctly display our events. And therefore, you also need to add a couple of images to your project. Now, for that, you can use any images you want. Just make sure that you do store them in the same folder I will store them in a second, and that you give them the same name. But you can then use any images you want. A great source, if you don't know where to get images from, is unsplash.com. There you can get free images, and that is where I will collect a couple of images. For example, if you search for programming, I'll use this image from James Harrison. And in my project, in the public folder now, I'll add an images subfolder and download and store the image in there. This coding event JPEG file now. And make sure you name your file also coding-event. So download any image you want, maybe also this one, but name it coding-event and store it in the images folder. Or if you named it differently or have a different extension, go to the dummy data.js file and adjust this image path appropriately. So the image name and extension. And with that, I'll collect 2 more images for my other 2 pieces of dummy data. For the next one, I'll search for introvert, because the next event is about introverts, just so that you don't have a strange impression of me. And here, I'll pick this image from Ahmed Nishat, and you can download this one as well, and store this in the images folder. In my case, under a name of introvert-event.jpg. Again, if you have a different name, adjust it in the dummy data.js file appropriately. And last but not least, you can search for networking on Unsplash, and then you might also find the same image I'm using here. This image here about a networking event, as it seems, which I now also downloaded and stored here. But again, you can of course use any images you want. So now we got the dummy data and we got the images set up. And it's important that the images are stored in the public folder. It doesn't have to be a folder named images then. It can be any folder or directly in the public folder. But you should store them in the public folder because the public folder also is a special folder in Next.js projects. Whatever is stored in there, typically images or fonts or something like this, is then served statically by Next.js. Which means you can reference it in your CSS code or in your HTML code. You can easily include images stored in the public folder because Next.js will make sure to serve any content that's stored in the public folder as part of your overall application. So it will statically serve any content in there. It makes the content in there available to the visitors of your website, and therefore you can easily then embed public content in your HTML code and so on. And we will utilize that throughout this course. Therefore, now we got the images and the dummy data in place. Let's now start working on those page components and let's fill them with some life. Now let's start with the home page. The goal here is to show the featured events. And therefore here we want to get all featured events. For this, in the dummy data.js file, I did prepare a getFeaturedEvents function which is exported, which accesses the dummy events array and then filters for events where the isFeatured flag is set to true. And all these event objects do have a isFeatured flag, which is either false or true. Hence here, we can now get all our featured events by using this getFeaturedEvents function. Now for this, you need to import it from dummy data, of course. You need to import getFeaturedEvents from dummy data. So call getFeaturedEvents, it's a function, so make sure you execute it and store the result in a featuredEvents constant. And now that we got the featured events, we want to output them down there. Now for this, we can add an unordered list here where we loop through all the featured events, but I will actually create a brand new standard React component for that. because it is generally a good practice to split your application and your JSX code into multiple smaller building blocks, into multiple components therefore, and then combine those components to compose your overall application from those components. Hence, we want to add a regular React component, and the question now is, where do we store such a component? That is generally up to you, but it should not be in the pages folder. In the pages folder, you should only have page components, because whichever files you create in here, those files will then automatically lead to routes being generated. So Next.js will pick up any files stored in pages and generate routes for them. And for the regular components, we don't want that. A list component here should not be reachable through a route. Instead, I want to use it in the JSX code of some other component, of this homepage component, for example. And therefore, you don't store regular components in the pages folder, but instead we create a brand new folder, for example, one named components. But you can use any name you want, but components is a name that of course makes sense, I would argue. Now in there, I will add an events subfolder where I want to store all my events related components. And then in this events subfolder, I will add a file, an event list.js file, which will hold the event list component. Regarding the file naming, it's up to you how you want to name this. You will also often see a file naming convention like this for JavaScript files that hold React components. For example, I use this notation in my React course. In Next projects, I often saw this notation, so all lowercase cap uppercase, and therefore I will stick to it, but it is totally up to you. There is no best practice or a bad way of doing it. You can name those files however you want. And now in the event list.js file, I want to set up my event list functional component, which will be responsible for rendering a list of events. Hence, it will use props because those events should be passed in from outside so that we can reuse the same event list component on the home page, where we then have some featured events, and on the all events page where we have a long list of all events. The event list component shouldn't care about where the events are coming from, but it should only care about outputting the events. Hence, it receives props so that the actual event items are passed in from outside, from the place where the event data is fetched. Hence, in here, I just in the end want to return an unordered list with all those events, and then simply expect that on the props, we get our, let's say, items prop. And I'm using object destructuring to pull that prop out of the props object. Of course, you don't need to do that. You could also just write props.items down there. I used object destructuring, so I will just write items, but that's up to you. Of course, the key here, the key name you use, is also up to you. It doesn't have to be items. That's just a name I will be using here, but since it's your component, you can name this however you want. So then we have those items, and now we want to map through them to output multiple list items. So to map our item object data, which has this shape here, into a list item, into a JSX element. And therefore, we go through all the events in the end, we pass an anonymous function to map, and then create a list item for every event we're getting here. Now, before we continue working on that, I will export this event list component, and I now want to create a brand new component which actually defines the JSX code for such a single event list item. So therefore, I'll add a new file next to the event list JavaScript file, and that's the event item.js file. Now again, the file name, of course, is up to you. And in here, in this file, I'll add a function, event item. I also expect some props here. because the concrete data for a single rendered event item also should be coming from outside of this component here. And of course, we also want to export this event item. And now in here, I want to return a list item and then set up all the HTML code in the end that defines how such an event item should be output. We'll work on that in a second. First of all, in event list.js, we can now import event item from ./event item, so from that file we just added, and then map our events to event item objects like this, so to event item components in the end. And now we need to pass some data into event item, the event data we're getting here in the event list component, and in event item we then define the JSX structure for this. And that's what we're going to do in the next lecture. So let's now work on the HTML, the JSX code of an event item. Now here you should follow along closely because I will also provide finished styles to you in a second, and those styles will only do their job correctly if you have the same HTML code. So therefore make sure you follow along closely. Of course, you can also always use the code snapshots you find attached to the last lecture of every module to compare your code to mine in case you have some deviation somewhere. And therefore, let's get started. I want to have an image here, an image element in every list item where we display the image of a chosen event or of a rendered event here. So we'll need to set up a source here and some alt text, and we'll work on the data in a second. For the moment, let's just create the HTML code. And then below that, I want to have a div below that image. In there, I want to have two more divs. And in the first div in here, I start with a title, an h2 element here, where we output the title of that event. Then below that, another div where I want to add a time element, which is a regular HTML element, where the time or the date should be output. And also then below this div, another div where the address should be output. For this, we can use the address HTML element, which is also a regular element, where we will soon render the address. With that, we can move on to the other main div, which we added side by side to this first div. And here in this div, I in the end want to have a clickable link. So for this, we can use the link component, which we need to import. We import link from next link, as you learned, so that we can set up a link that takes us to another page. So here we'll then need to set up the URL, the path to which it should navigate. We'll do this later. And then as a text, it could say explore event. That's the general markup, the general HTML code which I want to use. Now, of course, it's lacking the concrete data though. So for this, we're getting props because that data should be passed in from outside, and I'll again use object destructuring to pull out that data from the props. And I do expect that we get a title, that we get an image, that we get the date and a location and an ID. Of course, we could also just expect one event prop and pull out the data from there, but I expect multiple props here. You can, of course, expect whichever props you want. So now we got that, and now here, for example, we can output the title constant here, which we get from props. Now for date and address, I don't just want to output the data like this. Instead, I want to transform it a little bit first. For example, I want to set up a human readable date. And for this, I'll create a new date object and pass date to it, because date, as we're getting it here, will have this format, which is kind of human readable, but not really pretty. But thankfully, that is a format which we can pass to the date constructor to turn it in a JavaScript date object. And on such a date object, We can then call toLocale dateString and then transform this into a human readable date string. The first argument here is the locale we want to use, and I will use enus. And the second argument then is an object where we configure how the different parts of the date should be output. For example, that a day should be output in numeric format, month should be output in a long form, and year should be output in numeric format as well. Now, if you want to learn more about this toLocale dateString method, you can of course search for MDN toLocale dateString and find the kind of official docs on that. And here you learn how that works and which other options you would have when it comes to configuring the output. The configuration I chose here should work really well though, and therefore now here instead of date, I'll output the human readable date like this. Now for the address, I also want to format this, and I'll create a formatted address where I use the location, so this location prop we're getting, this one, and then on that I call replace, and I replace comma whitespace with /n. Now all the locations have such a comma in there to separate the street from the postal code and city, and I'm simply replacing that with /n, which adds a line break. So that's what I'm doing here. And therefore now we can use this formatted address down there. Now we'll need to add some styling for this line break to have an effect, but we're going to do that later as well. Now we also have an image, of course, which we want to set up here. And the image is just a string in the dummy data, which is a path to an image which we added locally here. So we have that images/image name path in our public folder. That's why you should make sure that this image path and name matches your path you added your image in. But now that we do have this link here, we now can bind source to /+ image. Image is our prop here, and image will be a string like this, and I'm just adding a / at the beginning. And since all the content in the public folder will be served statically by Next.js, this request to /images/image_name will succeed. We don't need to add public at the beginning here, so it's not /public/, but just /, because it's the content of the public folder which will be served statically. So public should be excluded because we don't need to dive into that folder first. It's the content of the folder which is being served by Next.js. So we can navigate as if we already were inside of that folder. Now for the alt text, I'll use my title again. With that, we're almost done, but we also want to wire up that link address, that link target here. And for this, I want to construct a link which takes this ID into account. I'll add a new constant here and name this explore link. Of course, this name is up to you. And here I'll use a template literal and start with /events/ and then inject something dynamic into this string. I'll inject the ID, the value which we get on the ID prop here. So that explore link is a string that includes that ID, and then it's this explore link which I bind here as a value to ref. And with all that done, this component lacks styling, but is generally ready to go. So now in event list, we need to pass all that data, which is expected by event item. We need to pass those props into event item here now. So here I add the ID prop and pass in event.id. I add the title prop and pass in event.title. We add the location prop and pass in event location, and so on. Do the same for the date with event date, and the same for the image with event image. And then since we're mapping here, and since we're creating a list of items, we should also set the key prop, which is not expected by our component, but by React, whenever you output a list dynamically. And here we pass in event ID as well, since that will be a unique identifier per list item. And now with all of that, we can use this event list component in our starting page component, so in the home page component. For this, we import the event list component from going up one level, diving into components, events, event list. And then here, instead of this unordered list, we can simply output event list like that. And now, last but not least, we just need to make sure that we pass in items to event list. So here in the homepage component, we set the items prop and pass our featured events into event list. And if we now save all files and reload, I get an error, numeric is not defined, because an event item, that should also be a string wrapped by quotes. Now if I save this, now we have a large image here. And yeah, if we scroll, we see the data is there. But of course, it's lacking styling. And that's therefore what we're going to work on next. How do we style our Next application? How do we style our components? Generally, that is totally up to you. Next.js supports styled components. You can use regular HTML code with regular selectors, classes, and so on. And you can also use CSS modules. And the support for the latter is actually already built into a Next.js project. Now that is what I'm going to use here, so that we have scoped CSS styles, scoped to specific components, at least if we want to, but you can definitely also explore other approaches for styling components. Now you will notice that we have this styles folder here, and in there we have a globals CSS file. Now here I set up some global CSS styles for you, and as I just said, you could of course add more classes here and then simply, set up any styles you want here. And you can also add more CSS files and, for example, import them in this app.js file where we are also already importing globals CSS. We haven't really learned what the role of this app.js file is, but for the moment you can keep in mind that here you could definitely import all your global CSS files. But I want to be able to scope styles to components, and therefore I will use the built-in CSS module support. Now, in case you don't know, CSS modules is all about setting up CSS code, which is then bound to a single component. So it does only affect that component and no other component. And that's a nice little feature which ensures that our styles don't spill over to other components. Now, therefore, I will create a separate CSS file for the event item component, a CSS file where I will define the styles for that component. And I could create that CSS file in the styles folder and import it from there, and that would work. But I will create it next to the event item.js file so that component code and component styles are located in the same place. That is a convention I like to follow. It makes it easier to find the styles for a given component. Therefore, here we add a new CSS file. We could name it event item, but to unlock this CSS module feature, this file actually has to end with .module.css. So event-item.module.css. The part here, event-item, that's up to you. That does not matter. But the ending, .module.css, that is important. Now with that, we can save this file, and now in event-item.js, we can import this file. We can import a CSS file into a JavaScript file, and behind the scenes, the Next.js build process will take care about that. It will basically extract the CSS code, change the selectors a little bit to scope them to this component HTML code, and inject it into the running page. We don't need to worry about that. We just need to import our CSS file, our event-item.module.css file. However, not just like this. Instead, we import classes or styles. The name is up to you. I'll go with classes from event-item.module.css. This is required for using this CSS modules feature. This classes thing here will be an object where all the CSS classes we define in this CSS file will be exposed under their class names so that we can assign them to HTML elements. This is required because the CSS class names we will add in this CSS file will be transformed under the hood by the build process to make them unique for this component. I also do talk about that in my React the Complete Guide course, in case you want to dive a bit deeper. Therefore, we import classes from this CSS file, and then we can, for example, go to our list item here, add the class name property, the class name attribute, and set this equal not to a string, but instead to a dynamic value, specifically to some key we get from this class's object. And here that should be the item key. Now in the CSS file, we can add an item class selector. So that name here has to match that name, which we're accessing here. And now we can define the styles in here, which will be applied to only this list item. So even if we would use the item class here, let's say in the event list component, if I would add this kind of class name here, even then, these styles set up here would not affect this one here, this unordered list item. Because with the CSS modules feature, the class name we assign here in the CSS file will be changed under the hood behind the scenes, and it will no longer be item once the application runs in the browser. Therefore, to get this magically changed file name, we get access to those transformed class names under this imported classes object, and we then access our originally assigned class name and get access to the actual transformed class name and assign this as a class name to the list item then. It sounds confusing? Let me show it to you. If we temporarily give this a color of red, so if that's the style we assign, and we then save all the files, if I now reload and I then inspect this here, you will see that this list item has a class of event-item _item _ some unique hash. And that's not the class name we defined in the CSS file. Instead, that is this transformed class name, and the link is made through our assignment of classes.item here. So that's now working under the hood, and it allows us to scope our CSS styles to a selected component. Now with that, attached you find two CSS files which I prepared for you. Because this course is no CSS course, I don't want to bore you with writing CSS code, and therefore attached you find the event-item.module CSS file and the event-list.module CSS file. And you should replace your event-item.module.css file with the attached one, and also add the event list module CSS file to this events folder in this components folder. Then, back in the event item.js file, we now need to assign more CSS class names. We should add classes.item on the list item, so on the li element, but then on this first div here, you should also add a class name of classes.content. Then on the div in there, add a class name of classes.summary. No class name on the h2 tag. On this div here, we add a class name of classes.date. No class name on the time element. On this div here, we add a class name of classes.address. And then here on this div, which holds the link, we add a class name of classes.actions. So these are a couple of class names we assign. And now we also need to go to the event list component and add some styles there. For this, in this event list component, we first of all also need to import classes from /event-list.module.css. And then on the unordered list item element, we add the class name prop and set this to classes.list. Because in this CSS file which I provided to you, there is a list class defined. And then with that, you should see that if you now reload, you have something like this on the screen. Still not the final look of everything, but a good step closer. Now, as a next step, let's work on this link and let's add a couple of icons. Let's continue working on our project here and let's continue with this link. At the moment, it looks a bit boring and I would like to have that link look like a button. Now we'll also use a button in some other places of our project, and therefore instead of styling it here in the event item component, I'll add a new component, which we can then reuse, which I'll add in a new folder, which I'll name UI for user interface. And in there, I'll add a button.js file to create a button component in there, which sets up this button so that we have a reusable button. For this, in this button.js file, we create a button component like this, a functional component, which we of course also export. And then in here, I will return a link. And for this, we need to import link from next link. And that link should of course hold a text which is passed in from outside, so between the opening and closing tags of our button component. Hence we can use props children here. And of course it should also lead somewhere, and I expect to get a link prop on this button which holds the actual link we want to go to, and set this as a value for the ref prop here. Now we got this button component. Attached, you now find this button.module.css file with some styles for this button. And just as before, to apply them, we now need to import classes from /button.module.css. And then to add those classes here, we need to actually add an element inside of the link component. We need to add an anchor tag element. And then on this anchor tag element, we can set the class name and set this to classes.button. Now, if we don't add the anchor tag, then the link automatically renders an anchor tag under the hood. An anchor tag where it basically controls what happens when that link is clicked though, so that we don't send a request for a new file, but instead it captures that request and loads a new page with JavaScript only. But if you want to apply custom styling, then you need to add that anchor tag on your own. And the link component will basically detect that there now is an anchor tag inside of it, and it will no longer render its own anchor tag, but instead render yours, but then add all that functionality where it captures clicks on that link and so on for you. So it will add that functionality, that all works. We just add our own anchor tag to add classes. We don't, and that's important, we don't set the ref attribute on this anchor tag though. As I just said, that will be added automatically by the link component, which is wrapped around that. So we just set it up like this. And now we can use this button component in the event item component. Here, instead of this link, we can now use our own button. And of course, for that, make sure you also import button from the UI folder and the button file. And then here we can still say explore event. And now we set the link prop on the button component because that's what I'm expecting here. I'm expecting a link prop. And I set this here equal to the explore link, just as before. And of course, this button technically now isn't a button but a link, but it will look like a button, hence the component name. If you now save all files, you should have this button look here. Now, adding a button was one important thing. I also want to add a couple of icons to ensure that the event items we're rendering look a bit nicer. For this, I prepared some icons for you, some icon components which you'll find attached. To be precise, attached you find an icons zip file which you can extract into your components folder, so that you end up with a third folder in the components folder, this icons folder, which holds free JavaScript files, which hold React component functions, which return SVG icons. Now, these icons are not created by me. I'm just sharing them with you so that we don't have to write that code together. Instead, these are icons from heroicons.com. Here I picked this location marker icon, I picked the calendar icon, and this arrow right icon. These icons are taken from heroicons.com, and I just pre-created these components for you so that we don't have to write all that code together. But I just copied the JSX code from heroicons.com. It's super easy to do. You even get a button for that here, and I created these components. Now, with these components added, we can go back to eventitem.js, and there I now got a couple of places where these icons should be inserted. For example, here in front of the time. There I want to render the date icon, so I'll add it here, and we now need to import it. We need to import date icon from, and then go up one level into icons, date icon like this. We can now also remove the link import, by the way, since we're not using the link component in this component anymore. So that's the date icon added. Above the address, I want to add the address icon like this. And for that, you of course also need to add the appropriate import. And we can also already import the arrow right icon from icons arrow right icon, because I will render that in my button. Here in this button, I don't just want to have this explore event text. Instead, this text should sit side by side to an icon. Hence, I'll wrap this text in a span and then add another span here. And in that second span, I'll render this arrow right icon, which I just imported. And this second span, important, also receives a class. It receives the icon class, like this. Again, if you save all files and you go back, you now should see these icons as part of these event cards here. And that is now the final look of the event items. We spent quite some time on them, but we will use them in a lot of different places of this application, and therefore that is of course something which I did want to make look good. Now let's work on the other pages, because thus far we never left the starting page. And we got more pages. For example, we got the page for a single event. And we can reach that page for a given event ID if we click those buttons, the Explore Event buttons. That sets the URL to /events/ID and loads the event detail page. So time to work on that. And of course, feel free to start working on that on your own. Output some event data there. In the next lecture, we're going to work on it together. And we're then also going to add some styles together, of course. So let's work on this event detail page now. We reach this page if in the URL we have something like events/ and then some event ID. So the goal is now to output the detailed data about this event. And for that, we of course need to fetch that data. Now we do have our dummy data array with all the events. And now we want to get an event by ID in the end. Now for this, I did provide this getEventById helper function here, which finds an event by ID, and hence we can call this function and pass an ID to that function to get an event by ID. That means that in the event detail page component, we now just need a way of getting hold of that ID, which is part of the URL. And you learned how that works. We can use the useRouter hook for that. We can import useRouter from Next.router like this, and then call useRouter to get hold of a router object provided by Next.js. And then you learned that on that router object, we can get access to a query property, which has all those dynamic path segments that led to this page as keys. So here we have event ID with a capital I as a name for this dynamic path segment. Hence on router.query, we can access event ID. This gives us access to the concrete value that was inserted in the URL when this page was loaded. So in this case, for example, it would be E2. And therefore this now is the event ID we're looking for. Now we can call getEventById, and for that we need to import that from the dummy data file, so make sure you add that import statement. And we pass the event ID as an argument to that function. And that will give us the event we're looking for. At least hopefully. Of course we could fail. If I, for example, manually enter something like test here, then we would not find an event for that, because in my dummy data, I have no event with an ID of test. So we should handle that case and check if event is maybe falsy by adding an exclamation mark here, in which case I want to return some error message that we didn't find an event. And for the moment, I'll just return a paragraph here where I say no event found, just like that. But if we make it past this if check, we know that we did find an event, and now we want to return and output data for that event. And for this, of course, it's totally up to you how you want that page to look like. I prepared a couple of components which we can use for outputting that event detailed data. Now these are regular React components, and I don't want to bore you with writing them, therefore you find them attached. Attached you find an event-detail zip file, which you can extract into your components folder. So that in the components folder you have that brand new event-detail folder. In there you'll find 4 component files, which in the end output some content, and also some styles for those files. Now, again, you can definitely go through them. This is all just standard React code, nothing Next.js specific in there, which is why I'm skipping this component creation, because in this course, whilst we of course also talk about React in general, I of course also want to focus on Next.js as much as possible. Therefore, these components are pre-built for you, and we can now use those components in this square bracket event ID file. Here, I'll replace this overall div with a fragment, which we import from React. So you need to add this import to use the built-in fragment wrapper component, which is needed if you have adjacent JSX elements, because normally that would lead to an error. With the fragment wrapper, you are allowed to have adjacent elements. And then here, I'll start by adding the event summary component. Now that's one of the components I provided to you, so we need to import event summary here from going up one level and another level, diving into components, event detail, and then there's this event summary file. And from that, we import event summary. And whilst we're here, we can already import another component, the event logistics component, from going up, components, event detail, event logistics, and import the event content component from going up and going up, components, event detail, event content. Now with those components imported, down here we output event summary, event logistics, and event content. Now, between the opening and closing tags of event content, we pass in a paragraph, which then receives event.description as a value. And event is this event we're fetching here from our dummy data by ID. And now we're accessing the description key to output that description text between the event content tags. Event summary needs a title property. You see that if you have a look at the component. Here I want the title property. So we pass in a title, and that is event.title therefore. And for the event logistics, there we need to pass in the date, the address, the image, and the image alt tag. So here I'll pass in event.date, then pass in an address prop, which has a value of event.location, pass in the image prop, event.image, and the image alt prop with event.title as a value. And just as before, you can of course have a look at event logistics and you see which props I'm expecting here and how I'm using them. In the end, the date is in the end just getting transformed again, same for the address text. And then I'm just outputting those different pieces of data, also with some icons and another component which is involved, which then also just handles how the icons and the text next to them is being rendered. That's what we do here. And with all of that done and added, if we now save this, if we save all these files, if I go to events/test, I get no event found. But if I go to M1, for example, as an ID, I mean E1, not M1. If I go to E1, then we see this content here. Now, if you zoom in a bit more, this will kind of break because I did not optimize it for all screen sizes, just some basic CSS code, because of course this is not primarily about the styling, but about, well, the logic and about Next.js. So this now is the output for a single event. Now from this page, we have no easy way of getting back to the other pages though. We can always manually change the URL, but we have no navigation bar, for example. Therefore, that's what we're going to dive in next. So some kind of general layout would be nice. A general navigation bar, which we have on all our pages, because at the moment we don't have that. Now for that, we can of course dive into all our page components and start adding some header at the top. So above our main content, we could add a header with a nav bar and so on. And we could do that, but we would repeat that code for all our page components in the end, since I want to have the same navigation bar in all those components. And that is where this _app.js file now becomes important. This in the end is the root component where the different page components are rendered in. This component, which is rendered here, that's your page component in the end. Next.js will use this _app component to hand your page content to it to then display it whenever you switch the page. So that's your page being rendered, this component. That means that we of course can wrap this component with some general layout component. We could wrap it with a fragment and add a header on top of it. And that is exactly what we're now going to do. For this, in the components folder, I'll add a new subfolder side by side to event detail, events, icons, and UI, and I will name it layout. And in this folder, I'll now add a layout.js file and a main header.js file. Now, the layout.js file will be fairly trivial. It holds a functional component, the layout component, and that component will receive some props. And of course, we also export this layout component here. And then here, I just want to return a fragment, which we import from React. So we import from React, we import the fragment, and then a main HTML element between which I output props.children, but then above that also my header. And I'll create that header in a separate file, in the main header.js file. In there, we add another component, the main header component, which we also export as a default here. And then in here, in this main header component, we return our header code. So here we'll have a header wrapper HTML element, and then in there, a div which holds our logo text in this case, since we'll not have any image logo in this application. And next to that logo, we'll then have a nav bar with our navigation items. Now let's start with the logo. That will be fairly trivial. I'll make it clickable by adding a link here, and hence we need to import link from next link. And I'll say next events here. That's my logo text. And it should be clickable and always take us back to the starting page. Hence ref here is just /nothing. /nothing so that when we click the logo, we're taken back to the starting page. Now in the nav part here, I'll add an unordered list of all the navigation items, though here it'll only be one nav item, which also is a link, because it also should be clickable. And here I'll say all events, because this should take me to the all events page. Or we say browse all events. And therefore here ref is /events to take us to this events page. Now some styling would be nice, and therefore again attached you find a CSS file. You find the main header.module CSS file attached, which contains some styles for this main header component. And hence we should import classes from /main-header.module.css here and assign these classes to the HTML code. On the header element, for example, you should assign a class of .header, so classes.header. On that div with the logo, it's classes.logo. On the nav, it's classes.navigation. And that's it. These are the three classes which are added here. With that, we prepared the main header component. And now in the layout component, we can add the main header here above our main HTML element. So for this, we need to import main header and then render it here. And now we just want to wrap our overall layout around all the page content. And that is exactly what we can do with this _app.js file. We simply wrap this component, which is our page content, with layout. So with our own layout component like this. And for this, of course, you should make sure that you import layout, this layout component which we just worked on. And we can wrap layout around that because in layout we do pass props children, so the content between the opening and closing layout tags, on to this main HTML element. So we render it between those main tags. And hence now if you save all files, you should see this navigation bar at the top. And if I click on next events, I'm taken back to the starting page. If I click on browse all events, I'm taken to the all events page, where we haven't added any content yet. And therefore, that's the next step. Let's work on this all events page now. So let's now work on this all events page. So on this index.js file in the events folder. Here, we want to render all events, not filtered, not featured, all events. And therefore, of course, we want to get all events. So here we grab all our events by reaching out to get all events, which is another helper function defined in the dummy data.js file. Here I have the getAllEvents function, which returns the entire dummy events array. So here we call that, and in order to call it, we need to import it from dummy data. Now that we got the events here, we want to render a list of those events. And that is where we can reuse our event list component. So at the top, we just need to import event list from, and then go up 2 levels, dive into components, events, event list, and then simply output this event list component again here. Event list, like this. And to event list, we still need to pass an items prop, just as we did before on the starting page, and we pass in all the events we loaded. So with that, if we save this, we see all the events here on this page. And that was super easy to do and super easy to add, because we already did work on the event items before in the earlier course lectures. Therefore, we now added a lot of functionality, but one crucial piece of functionality is missing. We also have this slug page where we want to filter for events and where we want to consume multiple path segments. So therefore, that will be the last main feature which we add before we'll then polish the overall app thereafter. Now my goal here is to add a filter area on this all events page above that list of events, where we can select a year and a month in drop-down menus. And when we selected a combination and clicked on Find Events, we change the URL and we go to this filter URL, to this slug page here. And on that page, we then read the filter values from the URL to pick the correct events. Sounds cryptic? Well, let's implement it together step by step. And the first step for that is to add a little filter box, a search box above that list of events on the All Events page. Now for this, I'll add a new component in this events folder, and I'll name it events-search.js. Now this will hold a functional component, the events search component, which receives props and which we, as always, export, of course, like this. And then in here, we'll have a couple of things which we need to do. First of all, I'll start with the JSX code that should be returned. Here, I want to return a form, because we'll have a couple of inputs, and those inputs can take different values, and ultimately they are submitted. So we have a form. And in that form, I have a div with another div inside, with a label inside where I say year. And this label will then be for a select element, so for a drop-down, which allows us to select a year. Therefore, I'll give this label the HTML4 attribute and set this to year, and give this the ID attribute and set it to year, so that we have this connection for accessibility reasons. Now in this select input here, for the year, I want to present 2 options, 2021 and 2022. Of course, you can pick any years here, though I picked these years because I have dummy data for those years here in my dummy data array. So these are my 2 options. I'll then give these options a value key each, which is the internal identifier, which I'll get access to later. And I'll set this to 21 and 22 as well, like this. So that's now the first dropdown. Now next to this div, so to this div here, which holds that first dropdown, I'll add another div with a second dropdown for the month. So here we'll have a label for the month, and hence I'll set the HTML4 attribute to month. And then below that, I'll add another select element. And looks like I accidentally deleted a div here, so let me re-add it. So then here I have another dropdown, and this will get an ID of month, like this. And then we need to add the options. And here we'll have 12 options because we have 12 months. So I'll start with January, and set the internal value here to 1. And then replicate this a couple of times so that here we also have February and set this to 2. Here we have 3 and March, and well, you can probably guess what comes thereafter. April and May, and 4 and 5, and then 6 and June, and so on. So I'll quickly complete this list here. July, and then also here we have August, and then we also need September and October and November and December, and then also update those numbers so that here we have 9 and 10 and 11, 11 and 12. So now these are the options for the second drop down here. And now below that, below all the divs, but inside of the form, I'll then also add my button again. So my button component, and therefore, of course, we need to import that. At the top, we want to import button from, going up one level, diving into UI, and then the button file. So that here we then have this button component, and on the button we can say find events. However, this button here shouldn't be a link. It should be a real button which submits the form of which it is part. And hence we need to go back into this button component in the UI folder and tweak it a little bit. Because this button component should either render a link, as it currently does, or a normal button. And it should render a link if the link prop is set. If it is not set, it should render a normal button. So here I will simply check if props link is truthy, so if that is set, and if it is, I'll return my link as I did before. Otherwise, if we make it past this if check, we don't have a link, and then I'll return a regular button. A button where we output props.children, so where we still pass on the content passed between the tags, and where we then set the onClick prop to props onClick, so that we can use our own button just as the built-in button. I also want to add a class name here and set this to classes.button as well, so that we still apply those CSS classes. With that, we can go back to the event search component. And here we are now therefore done with this JSX code. Again, some styling would be nice, and therefore just as before, attached you'll find some styles for this component. So attached you'll find an events search.module.css file, which you should add next to the events search.js file. And then here we import classes from /events-search.module.css, and then add a couple of class names to this JSX code. To the form, for example, we add classes.form. To this first div, we then add classes.controls, and those divs only exist for the styling. That's why I have these nested divs. Then here I'll have another div with a class of control. So the outer div has controls, the inner div has control. And we don't need to add anything to the label and so on, but this div here, which holds the month, also receives classes.control like this. And with that, we're done though. That adds all the styling that needs to be added. At the moment, of course, this component is missing any logic, but it at least has the JSX code and the styling. So we can already include it in this index.js file in the events folder in the pages folder. So on this all events page. Here we can import events search from going up, components, events, and then there events search. And now above the event list here, I'll add events search like this. We can now also replace this div, by the way, with a fragment if we want to import it from React. That's not mandatory, but I'll do it here because we don't really need that extra div. Now if we save all files, we should have this filter area or this search area above our events. Now it's therefore time to add some logic. Let's add some logic to the events search component. We got this form, but at the moment when this button is pressed and the form is submitted, we're not doing anything with that submitted data. And that should change. Therefore, I'll start by adding a nested function in the events search component, and I'll name this function submitHandler. That's the function that should be triggered when the form is submitted. So on the form element, we can add the onSubmit prop and point at submitHandler like this. Don't execute it, just point at it, so that submitHandler is executed by React when the form is submitted. Now, as you know, for example from my React course, we automatically get an event object here, because we're listening to a default DOM event. And here we should call event.preventDefault to prevent the browser default of sending an HTTP request, which I don't want to do here and which would reload our page and therefore lose all our application state. Instead, I want to handle this submission with JavaScript and therefore we prevent that default. And once that is prevented, we can now read the selected year and month. Now for that, we could set up two-way binding with useState and so on, but since I'm only interested in the values once when the form is submitted, I'll instead work with refs. Another key React feature which you should be aware of. If you're not, definitely take a React refresher or take my React the Complete Guide course where I dive into all React concepts in great depth. So here we'll then import useRef from React, and then we can set up our refs here, and we'll need two refs since we have two inputs. We'll have the year input ref, and hence I'll create my first ref with useRef, and the month input ref, and hence here I'll create this as well. And now that we got these two refs created, we need to connect them to the select elements. So on the year select element, I'll add the special ref prop and point at the year input ref. And on the month select element, I'll also add the ref prop and point at the month input ref. Now the refs are connected, and therefore now in this submit handler, we can get the selected year by accessing year input ref.current. You always use .current to get access to the actual value the ref is connected to, so in this case to the select element. And then, since this gives us access to the select element, so to the JavaScript object representing that select element, we can access the value property, which every select JavaScript object has. So every JavaScript object representing a select element has a value property. Therefore, we can access this here to get access to the selected value. And we repeat that for the selected month. So with month input ref.current.value, we get access to the selected value on the month select element. And now we just need to kind of do something with those values. And I don't want to utilize them here in events search, even though we could do that, but instead I want to pass them to my all events page. And in there, I then want to programmatically navigate to that slug page here. And here we need programmatic navigation because we want to do that once some action completed. In this case, once the form submission completed and we extracted all the form values. So that's a typical example for programmatic navigation. Hence, as a first step, I do expect that on the props of this events search component, I have a prop, let's say, named onSearch. This name is up to you, but I'll name it onSearch following this convention because I expect that onSearch, the value for this prop, is a function, which I therefore can execute here. And it should be a function which accepts two parameters, the selected year and the selected month. So I'll call this function, and now we need to make sure that such a function is passed into events search through the onSearch prop. So in this Next.js file in the events folder, so therefore on the all events page, we now need to set up this function here. Here we need to add a new function in this component the find events handler function, for example, which expects a year and a month in this order, because that's how I'm then calling this function here. We're calling this function and we're passing in a year as a first argument and a month as a second argument. Hence, that's what I expect here. And then we do something with that. And it's now this function which is passed to the events search component through the onSearch prop, which we just used in there. So here I then pass at find events handler. We don't execute it here, we just point at it so that it's executed for us by this event search component here with this line of code after the form was submitted and we extracted our values. So then here find events handler will execute. And in here we now want to programmatically navigate. So for that we can import use router from next/router like this, and then call use router here outside of this inner function directly in the component function. All React hooks need to be called directly in your component function, not in any nested block statements. And that gives us access to the router like this. And on this router, inside of the find events handler, we can then call push to go to a different page. That's what you also learned in the previous course section. Now I'll construct the full path I want to go to here with a template literal. And the full path will be /events/ and now 2 dynamic segments so that we reach this slug here. And the first dynamic segment will be my year, and then / and then the second dynamic segment, which is month. Now just to be clear, we could have more segments here, and this slug route would still be triggered. It simply consumes an unlimited amount of segments after /events. If we only have one segment, slug will not be triggered because we have a more specific route for that with the event ID file. And Next.js is pretty smart about that, and it sees that for one argument, for one dynamic parameter after events, we have a specific page, but for 2 or more, we have no specific pages, and therefore then this slug will kick in. So for this path, we'll reach the slug page here. And therefore that's the full path I want to navigate to. And with all that, if we now save this, if we now select, let's say, May 2021, and I click on find events, we are taken to /events/2021/5, which is May 2021, and we are on that filtered events page, just as expected. So now, as a last step before the final polishing, let's now load the proper events for this filter criteria. So let's now display our filtered events. So let's work on this slug page therefore. On this page, we now got a couple of things to do. We need to extract the dynamic segment values, which are part of the URL that led to this page. And we need to extract the year and the month and then find the events that meet this year and month. Now in the dummy.js file, I already prepared a getFilteredEvents function, which expects an object with a year and a month key, where I then look for the events that have the respective year and month. And they need to have both. So this is not an OR filter, but an AND filter. I'm looking for events that have both the selected year and the selected month. So that logic is already in place, but in the slug component we now need to extract the data from the URL. And for this we again can use the use router hook. This gives us access to the data encoded in the URL, and this slug page is no exception. So here we now import use router from next router, and then we create our router object by calling use router like this. Now here we can get our filter data by accessing router.query.slug. But what is that filter data? Well, let's recall what it is by quickly logging it to the console, that filter data. Let's log it to the console, go back here to this events page, to this filtered events page for events /2021/5, and open the DevTools and reload, and we see that it's such an array. It's an array with two elements, and the first element is the first segment, the second element is the second segment, and if we had more segments, we would have more items in that array. We also have undefined being logged here because actually this component is rendered twice because of how React works and how that route data is extracted. Effectively, this hook extracting the route data runs after the component was rendered for the first time. So the first time the component renders, we don't have access to that URL data yet. That's not a problem per se, but we'll have to make sure that we only look for filtered events once we got access to the URL data. And in addition, of course, we want to make sure that we don't try to look for events if there is a third parameter, if there is ABC at the end. Or at least we don't want to include that in our query, in our filter logic. So to make sure that this works appropriately, I'll first of all check if filter data is falsy by adding an exclamation mark here, so that when it is undefined, which it will be when the component is rendered for the first time, it's then automatically rendered again, but it is rendered without filter data when it is rendered for the first time. And when that happens, I want to return, let's say, a paragraph where I say loading. And we can give this paragraph a class name of center. And here that's a regular string because that is a globally defined CSS class in the globals CSS file. So here it's a regular string which I set as a class name to apply this global CSS class, so not a scoped class. And with that we take care that we don't get an error just because we don't have access to the URL data yet. That's simply how the user router hook works internally. But now, of course, when the component is then automatically rendered for the second time, we do have access to the data, and therefore now we do want to look for the appropriate events. For this, I'm only interested in the first two segments, which I know will be the year and the month. So I'll get my filtered year by accessing filtered data, the first element, and we get the filtered month by accessing the second element with index 1. Now, the data which we get here is in a string format. It's always a string because it's encoded in the URL. And I need numbers. Therefore, I'll set up my num year by transforming filtered year to a number by adding a plus in front of it. And the same here for the month. With num month, I transform this to a number by adding a plus in front of filtered month. So that transforms that data to numbers. Now, of course, for some reason, we could fail to do that. Because, for example, someone manually entered /events/abc/5. And in that case, ABC would of course not be a valid year. So we also want to handle that scenario. And therefore I'll add a if check where I check if my num year, so my year transformed to a number, is not a number, which would happen if that is a string like ABC, for example. Then we can't convert it to a number, and this here would produce not a number as a type. So I'll check if my num year is not a number, or if my num month is not a number. If either of the two failed, something is wrong about that URL. I'll also check, as an additional condition under which I want to fail, if my year, let's say, is greater than 2030, let's say that's the highest year I want to support, or if it's below 2021. And I'll also check if my month is maybe smaller than 1, which makes no sense, or if the month is greater than 12, which also makes no sense. If either of these things is true, if either of these conditions is met, I don't want to continue because then something is wrong with the filter. So then I'll just return some output where I, for example, say invalid filter, please adjust your values. So now with that, if we save this, and I would load this page for /events/abc5, I would get invalid filter, please adjust your values. Now, assuming that we do have a valid year and a valid month, I now can expect to find events though, at least if such events exist for the chosen year and months. So now I can get my events, my filtered events here. I can add this constant by executing getFilteredEvents, which is this function we have to import from the dummy data file. That function I showed you a couple of seconds ago. We execute this function, and this function wants to get an object with a year and a month field. So here I'll set the year field to num year and the month field to num month, passing on those converted year and month values as numbers to getFilteredEvents. That then gives us our filtered events array. Now, of course, that could be an empty array though, if we don't find any events for the chosen year and month. So therefore, we want to check if filtered events are falsy for some reason, or if they're not falsy but an empty array. So if filtered events length is maybe equal to 0. If either of these two conditions is met, then we had a valid filter, but we simply don't find any events for that filter. And in this case here, I also want to return some text where I simply say no events found for the chosen filter. Something like that. And now if we made it past this if check as well, we know that we do have valid events. So therefore now in the next lecture, we'll then output those events. So let's now output the filtered events we identified. For this, of course, we can again use our event list component, which we created at the beginning of this module. So I'll import event list from going up, components, events, event list. And then here I'll output event list like this and set my items equal to the filtered events array which we're producing here. Now if we save this and I do enter a valid combination like /events/2021/5, I'm looking for events from May 2021, and you see I do render 2 events here because indeed I do have 2 events which date is in May 2021. So these are being displayed here then. So that's working as it should, and therefore now let's just finish this app up, polish it a little bit, add a couple of extra styles and components, and then wrap up this module. So to polish this all a little bit, I'll start by adding a new component which I prepared for you. Attached you find a results title zip file which contains a results title component and its styles, and you should drag the JavaScript and the CSS file, which is part of that attached zip file, into your events folder. So that in there you then have the results title JS file and the results title module CSS file. And that's a very simple component which I just want to render on top of the event list here in the slug component. So here I'll then output the results title and replace that div with a fragment, and make sure that we import both results title as well as fragment in this component now. Fragment from React and results title from this file we just added. Now results title, this component, actually wants a date property, a date prop, which it then outputs in a human readable way, and therefore we should make sure that we provide this date prop. And to pass that to results title, down here I'll create a date constant where I instantiate a new date object to which I pass my num year and num month. That is a way of creating a date based on a year and month. The only important thing here is that you need to deduct 1 from the month because that is a 0-based index here for the month. The date constructor function expects the month to begin at 0, not at 1, which is why I deduct 1 here. And then we can set the date prop on results title and pass in our date object. And with that, we just have this little extra detail on top of that, and we can now go back to all events again. Now I also want to polish messages like this one here, when we didn't find any events, or when we have an invalid filter like for ABC. I want to present this in a nicer way and also provide a button to go back to the all events page then. And therefore for this in this slug page component, let's work on this error message here when we don't find any matching events. I'll wrap this paragraph in a fragment. So we need to import fragment from React, but we already did so before, so that should already be there. And we put the paragraph in there so that below the paragraph, we can also output a button. So we need to import button from our own component file. And with the button added here on the button, I'll say show all events, and that should be a link. So I'll set the link prop to /events. Now that button should actually be centered, so I'll wrap it in a div with that global center class I showed you in one of the last lectures. And I'll do the same thing for this invalid filter error. I'll wrap this in a fragment as well and add my button here as well as this paragraph, move that all into the fragment so that here we also got a way of going back. Now we have the button, but the message still looks ugly, and for that I prepared another component for you, which you also find attached. It's a component you should move into your UI folder, the error alert component, which is attached. This error alert component gives us a nice container for error messages like this. And therefore in the slug component, we should import error alert from and then dive into the UI folder in the components folder and into the error alert file, and then simply wrap the paragraph here for the invalid filter, for example, with error alert with this component. Simply wrap it around this paragraph, and if you do so, this now looks nicer. Now for the case that we don't find any events, I also want to use that component. So therefore, for this error message down here, for the no events found message, we can also wrap this into an error alert like that. I also want to use that error alert in the event ID page here, because here we also have the case that we didn't find an event for a chosen event ID. And therefore here, just as before, I'll import error alert from going up, components, UI, error alert, and then wrap this paragraph with it. So error alert wrapped around this paragraph, so that if we do look for an event which doesn't exist, for example, /events/test, so just one dynamic segment after events, but a segment value which doesn't match any event ID, I get no event found. And with that, we should be good. Now we wired up all those different values and pages, and they're now all working the way they should work. We can filter, we can show all events, we can dive into a single event, and we made that work with standard React and Next.js. So this is it for this course section. We wrote quite a bit of code, added quite a bit of components, most importantly, of course, a couple of page components. And hopefully all those core features, which we had a look at in this module, now make a lot of sense to you. It should be clear how routing works with Next.js, how these different page files are translated in different routes, how such slug routes work, and how the single dynamic parameter routes work, and how we can wire up all those different things with each other. It should also be clear now how you can mix regular React components, which have no Next.js specific features in them, with Next.js page components, which in the end are also just regular React components though, just treated in a special way because they're in a special folder. We also again saw how we can use the useRouter hook to get access to the router and through the router either navigate programmatically or get access to data encoded in the URL, and how with all those features we could make sure that we build a basic application like this. Now with all of that, we learned a lot, but we're still only scratching the surface, because we now had a detailed look at file-based routing, which is one of the main features Next.js offers. Let's now also take a closer look at data fetching, another key Next.js feature.